Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, a passage known as the Pericope Adulterae, Pericope de Adultera, or Pericope de Adultera, is a famous passage, pericope, found in the Gospel of John chapter 7, 53-8, 11. In this episode, after Jesus has sat down in the temple to teach some of the people, after he spent the previous night at the Mount of Olives, a group of scribes and Pharisees confront Jesus, interrupting his teaching session. They bring in an adulteress, and invite Jesus to pass judgment upon her. Should she be stoned, as Moses taught, or not? Jesus first ignores the interruption, and writes on the ground as though he does not hear them. But after the religious leaders continue their challenge, he states that the one who is without sin is the one who should cast the first stone. The religious leaders depart, leaving Jesus and the woman in the midst of the crowd. Jesus then asks the woman if anyone has condemned her. When she answers that no one has condemned her, Jesus says that he, too, does not condemn her, and tells her to go and sin no more. Although nothing in this story contradicts anything else in the Gospels, many analysts of the Greek text and manuscripts of the Gospel of John have argued that it was certainly not part of the original text of St. John's Gospel. The Jerusalem Bible claims the author of this passage is not John. On the other hand, Leo the Great, Bishop of Rome, or Pope, from 440 to 61, cited the passage in his 60-second sermon, mentioning that Jesus said to the adulteress who was brought to him, "Neither will I condemn you. Go and sin no more." In the early 400s, St. Augustine used the passage extensively, and from his writings it is also clear that his heretical contemporary Faustus also used it, as well as a group of unbelievers. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, declared that the Latin Vulgate, the Gospels of which were produced by Jerome in 383, based on Greek manuscripts which Jerome considered ancient at that time, and which contains the passage, was authentic and authoritative. In terms of simple quantities, 1,495 Greek manuscripts include the Pericope Adulterae, or part of it, supporting the inclusion of the passage as a whole, and 267 do not include it. Among those 267, however, are some manuscripts which are exceptionally early and which most textual analysts consider the most important. The subject of Jesus' writing on the ground was fairly common in art, especially from the Renaissance onwards, with examples by artists including those by Pieter Bruegel and Rembrandt. There was a medieval tradition, originating in a comment attributed to Ambrose, that the words written were terra, terram, accusat, earth accuses earth, which is shown in some depictions in art. For example, the Codex Egberti. This is very probably a matter of guesswork based on Jeremiah.Chapter 17:13. There have been other speculations about what Jesus wrote. The passage, John chapter 7, 53-8, 11 in the New Revised Standard Version. 53 Then each of them went home. 1 While Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. 2 Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him and he sat down and began to teach them. 3 The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them. 4 They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery." 5 Now in the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? 6 They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. 7 When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." 8 And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. 9 When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. 10 Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" 11 She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again." Single quote. Interpretation. This episode, and its message of mercy and forgiveness balanced with a call to holy living, have endured in Christian thought. Both "let him who is without sin cast the first stone" and "go and sin no more" have found their way into common usage. The English idiomatic phrase "to cast the first stone" is derived from this passage. The passage has been taken as confirmation of Jesus' ability to write, as opposed to read. In early societies, simple reading skills were more common than the ability to write, otherwise only suggested by implication in the Gospels. But the word epsilon gamma rho alpha phi epsilon nu in John chapter 8 could mean draw, as well as write. Mosaic law. Deuteronomy chapter 22:22-24 states, "If a man is found lying with a woman married to her husband, then both of them shall die, the man that lay with the woman, and the woman. So you shall put away the evil from Israel. If a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to her husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away the evil from among you." In this passage and also in Leviticus chapter 20:10, death is fixed as the penalty of adultery, applicable to both the man and the woman concerned. However, stoning as the form of death is only specified when a betrothed virgin is violated, and is assumed to have consented. If she did not consent, she would have cried out, and in an urban setting her cry would have been heard. The Gospel narrative does not refer to the woman's partner in adultery being brought before Jesus, or under threat of being punished. Textual history. The Pericope is not found in most of the early Greek Gospel manuscripts. It is not in P66, and it is not in P75, both of which have been assigned to the late 100s or early 200s. Nor is it in two important manuscripts produced in the early, mid-300s, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The first surviving Greek manuscript to contain the Pericope is the Latin-Greek diglot Codex Egberti, produced in the 400s or 500s, but displaying a form of text which has affinities with Western readings used in the 100s and 200s. Codex Egberti is also the earliest surviving Latin manuscript to contain it. Out of 23 Old Latin manuscripts of John chapters 7-8, 17 contain at least part of the Pericope, and represent at least 3 transmission streams in which it was included. According to Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, composed in the early 300s, Papias, circa AD 110, refers to a story of Jesus and a woman, accused of many sins, as being found in the Gospel of the Hebrews, which might refer to this passage or to one like it. In the Syriac Didascalia Apostolorum, composed in the mid-200s, the author, in the course of instructing bishops to exercise a measure of clemency, states that a bishop who does not receive a repentant person would be doing wrong, for you do not obey our Saviour and our God, to do as he also did with her that had sinned, whom the elders set before him, and leaving the judgment in his hands, departed. But he, the searcher of hearts, asked her and said to her, "Have the elders condemned thee, my daughter?" She said to him, "No, Lord." And he said unto her, "Go your way, neither do I condemn thee. In him therefore, our Saviour and King and God, be your pattern." O bishops. Quote, the Constitutions of the Holy Apostles, Book 2. 24. Compose c. 380. Echoes the Didascalia Apostolorum, alongside a utilization of Luke chapter 7. 47. Codex Fuldensis, which was produced in AD 546, and which, in the Gospels, features an unusual arrangement of the text that was found in an earlier document, contains the adulterae pericope, in the form in which it was written in the Vulgate. More significantly, Codex Fuldensis also preserves the chapter headings of its earlier source document, thought by some researchers to echo the Diatessaron produced by Tatian in the 170s, and the title of chapter number 120 refers specifically to the woman taken in adultery. The important codices L and Delta do not contain the Pericope Adulterae, but between John chapter 7, 52 and 8, 12, each contains a distinct blank space, as a sort of memorial left by the scribe to signify remembrance of the absent passage. Pacian of Barcelona, bishop from 365 to 391, in the course of making a rhetorical challenge, opposes cruelty as he sarcastically endorses it. O Novatians, why do you delay to ask an eye for an eye? Kill the thief, stone the petulant. Choose not to read in the Gospel that the Lord spared even the adulteress who confessed, when none had condemned her. Pacian was a contemporary of the scribes who made Codex Sinaiticus. The writer known as Ambrose c. 370–380, mentioned the occasion when Jesus spared her who had been apprehended in adultery. The unknown author of the composition, Apologia David, thought by some analysts to be Ambrose, but more probably not, mentioned that people could be initially taken aback by the passage in which we see an adulteress presented to Christ and sent away without condemnation. Later in the same composition he referred to this episode as a lection in the Gospels, indicating that it was part of the annual cycle of readings used in the church services. Peter Chryslogis, writing in Ravenna c. 450, clearly cited the Pericope Adulterae in his Sermon 115. Sedulius and Gelasius also clearly used the passage. Prosper of Aquitaine and Quodvoldius of Carthage, in the mid-400s, utilized the passage. A text called the Second Epistle of Pope Callistus section 6 contains a quote that may be from John 8:11, let him see to it that he sin no more, that the sentence of the gospel may abide in him. Go, and sin no more. Quote. However, this text also appears to quote from 8th century writings and therefore is most likely spurious. Until recently, it was thought that no Greek church father had taken note of the passage before the 1100s. However, in 1941 a large collection of the writings of Didymus the Blind, c. 313–398, was discovered in Egypt, in which Didymus states that, we find in certain Gospels, an episode in which a woman was accused of a sin, and was about to be stoned. But Jesus intervened, and said to those who were about to cast stones, he who has not sinned, let him take a stone and throw it. If anyone is conscious in himself not to have sinned, let him take a stone and smite her. And no one dared, and so forth. This is far from a direct quotation, but it may be a loose summary of the episode, barring the possibility that Didymus was referring to some other gospel than the four-gospel collection that was typically used in the churches in his time. This reference appears to establish that the passage was present in its usual place in some Greek manuscripts known in Alexandria and elsewhere from the 300s onwards. In Codex Vaticanus, which was produced in the early 300s, perhaps in Egypt, or in Caesarea, by copyists using exemplars from Egypt. The text is marked at the end of John chapter 7 with an umlaut in the margin. indicating that an alternative reading was known at this point. However, the date of these umlauts, or disdigmari, is a matter of some debate. This codex also has an umlaut alongside blank space following the end of the Gospel of John, which may convey that whoever added the umlaut was aware of additional text following the end of John chapter 21, which is where the Pericope Adulterae is found in the F1 group of manuscripts. Jerome, writing around 417, reports that the Pericope Adulterae was found in its usual place in many Greek and Latin manuscripts in Rome and the Latin West. This is confirmed by some Latin fathers of the 300s and 400s, including Ambrose of Milan and Augustine. The latter claimed that the passage may have been improperly excluded from some manuscripts in order to avoid the impression that Christ had sanctioned adultery. Certain persons of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be given impunity in sinning, removed from their manuscripts the Lord's act of forgiveness toward the adulteress, as if he who had said, "Sin no more," had granted permission to sin. Quote, History of Textual Criticism on John chapter 7, 53–8, 11. The first to systematically apply the critical marks of the Alexandrian critics was Origen. In the Septuagint column, Origen used the system of diacritical marks which was in use with the Alexandrian critics of Homer, especially Aristarchus, marking with an obelus under different forms, as, quote, called lemniscus, and, quote, called a hyperlemniscus, those passages of the Septuagint which had nothing to correspond to in Hebrew, and inserting, chiefly from Theodotion under an asterisk, those which were missing in the Septuagint. In both cases a metabellus, y, marked the end of the notation. Early textual critics familiar with the use and meaning of these marks in classical Greek works, like Homer, interpreted the signs to mean that the section, John chapter 7, 53–8, 11, was an interpolation and not an original part of the Gospel. During the 16th century, Western European scholars, both Catholic and Protestant, sought to recover the most correct Greek text of the New Testament, rather than relying on the Vulgate Latin translation. At this time, it was noticed that a number of early manuscripts containing John's Gospel lacked John chapter 7, 53–8, 11 inclusive, and also that some manuscripts containing the verses marked them with critical signs, usually a lemniscus or asterisk. It was also noted that, in the lectionary of the Greek Church, the Gospel reading for Pentecost runs from John chapter 7, 37–8, 12, but skips over the 12 verses of this pericope, beginning with Lachmann, in Germany, 1840. Reservations about the pericope became more strongly argued in the modern period, and these opinions were carried into the English world by Samuel Davidson, 1848–51, Tregethlas, 1862, and others. The argument against the verses being given body and final expression in Hort, 1886. Those opposing the authenticity of the verses as part of John are represented in the 20th century by men like Cadbury, 1917, Colwell, 1935, and Metzger, 1971. According to 19th-century text critics Henry Alford and F. H. A. Scrivener, the passage was added by John in a second edition of the Gospel along with 5:3.4 in the 21st chapter. On the other hand, a number of scholars have strongly defended the Johannine authorship of these verses. This group of critics is typified by such scholars as Nolan, 1865, and Bergen, 1886, and Hoskia, 1920. More recently it has been defended by O. T. Fuller, 1978, and is included in the Greek New Testaments compiled by Wilbur Pickering, 1980-2014, Hodges and Farstad, 1982-1985, and Robinson and Pierpont, 2005. Rather than endorsing Augustine's theory that some men had removed the passage due to a concern that it would be used by their wives as a pretense to commit adultery, Bruegel proposed, but did not develop in detail, a theory that the passage had been lost due to a misunderstanding of a feature in the election system of the early Church. The theory that the passage was original, but was lost due to its treatment in an early election cycle, explains not only its absence from some manuscripts, but also its appearance in the F1 Caesarian group of manuscripts at the end of John, and its appearance in the F13 group after Luke chapter 21:38. The same mechanism accounts for the movement of the passage in a smattering of manuscripts to precede John chapter 7:37, and, in a few others, to follow John chapter 8:12. One form of this theory is that at a very early date, an annual election cycle was developed for the major feast days. In this election cycle, a specific segment of the Gospel of John was assigned to be read at Pentecost, which was celebrated by the Christian Church from its beginning, having been adopted from Judaism. John chapter 7:37-52, plus 8:12. In order to close the reading on a positive note, this is still the form of the lection for Pentecost in the Byzantine lectionary cycle, attested in hundreds of copies. In an early copy used by a lector, the person designated to read scripture in early church services, marks were added to signify that the reader was to stop at the end of 7:52, and skip to the beginning of 8:12. When a professional copyist, unfamiliar with the lection cycle, used such a copy as his exemplar, he misunderstood the marks as if they meant that he, the copyist, should skip from the end of 7:52 to the beginning of 8:12, and thus the passage was dutifully skipped, and was lost, in a very influential transmission line. Another form of this theory is that a very early copyist, preparing a Gospel's codex for liturgical use, transplanted the section to the end of John as a practical step, so as to simplify the lector's task on Pentecost, so that the lector would not have to pause to find the final portion of the lection, and after the section was thus transplanted, it dropped out altogether from the Alexandrian transmission line, which is represented by the oldest manuscripts, and from related branches, including one which later yielded, or influenced, the Syriac Peshitta. The transplantation of the passage, in a few manuscripts, to precede John chapter 7:37, or to follow 8:12, is a scribal adaptation intended to simplify things for the lector by presenting the lection for Pentecost as one uninterrupted segment of text. Likewise, in the F13 group of manuscripts, the Pericope Adulterae has been transplanted out of the Gospel of John, and has been placed at the end of Luke chapter 21, so as to conveniently arrange the reading for St. Pelagia's feast day, October 8, near Luke chapter 21, 12-19. The lection for Saints Sergius and Bacchus, October 7. Inasmuch as all these movements of the passage are different effects of the lection cycle, the complete absence of the passage, it is proposed, is just one more example of this phenomenon, albeit attested in manuscripts earlier than the earliest clear evidence of election cycle in which this passage was read at Pentecost. Defenders of the genuineness of the passage have also noted the following. In some of the early manuscripts in which the Pericope Adulterae does not appear after John chapter 7:52, such as P66 and P75 and Codex N, the final page of the Gospel of John has not survived. making it impossible to see whether or not the passage had been transplanted to the end of the book. Some medieval manuscripts in which the Pericope Adulterae does not appear after John chapter 7:52, such as Codex Lambda, and several minuscules, mention that the passage was found in ancient copies. In minuscule 565 unrelated copies, a note states that although the Pericope Adulterae was found following John chapter 7:52, it was moved to the end of the Gospel of John. Several of these manuscripts also feature the Jerusalem colophon, which states that they were descended from, or proofread with, ancient copies at Jerusalem. Palestinian Aramaic evidence clearly shows that before it was made, the Pericope Adulterae had been transferred to the end of the Gospel of John. In many of the manuscripts in which asterisks or other marks appear in the margin alongside the passage, the marks do not accompany 7:52-8:2, but only 8:3-11, thus indicating where to find the lection for the feast day of Saint Pelagia. The notion that the asterisks in these copies were intended to express scribbled out is a misunderstanding of the lectionary apparatus. Without 7:53-8:11 in the text, John's narrative shifts abruptly from a scene in which the religious leaders are gathered in their own meeting, in 7:52, to a scene, in 8:12-20, in which Jesus is teaching in the temple treasury. It is intrinsically unlikely that anyone would begin a floating anecdote with the sentence, "And everyone went to his own house." Quote, almost all modern critical translations include the Pericope Adulterae at John chapter 7:53-8:11, exceptions being the New English Bible and Revised English Bible, which relocate it after the end of the Gospel, but most others enclose it in brackets, and/or add a footnote mentioning the absence of the passage in the oldest witnesses. NRSV, NJB, NIV, GNT, NASB. Authorship. Arguments against Johannine authorship. Bishop J. B. Lightfoot wrote that absence of the passage from the earliest manuscripts, combined with the occurrence of stylistic characteristics atypical of John, together implied that the passage was an interpolation. Nevertheless, he considered the story to be authentic history. As a result, based on Eusebius's mention that the writings of Papias contained a story about a woman falsely accused before the Lord of many sins, H.E. 3.39, he argued that this section originally was part of Papias' interpretations of the sayings of the Lord, and included it in his collection of Papias fragments. But D. Ehrman concurs in misquoting Jesus, adding that the passage contains many words and phrases otherwise alien to John's writing. However, Michael W. Holmes has pointed out that it is not certain that Papias knew the story in precisely this form, inasmuch as it now appears that at least two independent stories about Jesus and a sinful woman circulated among Christians in the first 2 centuries of the Church, so that the traditional form found in many New Testament manuscripts may well represent a conflation of 2 independent shorter, earlier versions of the incident. Kyle R. Hughes has argued that one of these earlier versions is in fact very similar in style, form, and content to the Lucan special material, the so-called L source, suggesting that the core of this tradition is in fact rooted in very early Christian, though not Johannine, memory. Arguments for Johannine authorship. There is clear reference to the Pericope Adulterae in the primitive Christian Church and the Syriac Didascalia Apostolorum. 2. 246. ed. Funki. 93. Zane C. Hodges and Arthur L. Farstad argue for Johannine authorship of the Pericope. They suggest there are points of similarity between the Pericope's style and the style of the rest of the Gospel. They claim that the details of the encounter fit very well into the context of the surrounding verses. They argue that the pericope's appearance in the majority of manuscripts, if not in the oldest ones, is evidence of its authenticity. Manuscript evidence. Both Novum Testamentum Grace, NA 27, and the United Bible Societies, UBS 4, provide critical text for the pericope, but mark this off with double brackets, indicating that the pericope is regarded as a later addition to the text. However, UBS 4 rates its reconstruction of the wording of the pericope as a meaning virtually certain to reflect the original text of the edition in NA 28. However, a reading in 2 Peter chapter 2:18 that had been ranked a virtually certain was rejected and replaced with a rival reading. Exclude pericope. Papyri 66, c. 275. Early 3rd century. Codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. 4th century. Also apparently Alexandrinus and Ephraemi. 5th. Codices Washingtonianus and Borgianus, also from the 5th century. Regius from the 8th, but with a blank space expressing the copyist's awareness of the passage. Aethus Lavrensis, c. 800. Petropolitanus Purpurus, Macedoniensis, Sangallensis, with a distinct blank space. And Coridithi from the 9th century and Monachensis from the 10th. Uncials 0141 and 0211. Minuscules 3, 12, 15, 21, 22, 32, 33, 36, 39, 44, 49, 63, 72, 87, 96, 97, 106, 108, 124, 131, 134, 139, 151, 157, 169, 209, 213, 228, 297, 388, 391, 401, 416, 445, 488, 496, 499, 501, 523, 537, 542, 554, 565, 578, 584, 703, 719, 723, 730, 731, 736, 741, 742, 768, 770, 772, 773, 776, 777, 780, 799, 800, 817, 827, 828, 843, 896, 989, 1077, 1080, 1100, 1178, 1230, 1241, 1242, 1253, 1333, 2106, 2193, 2768 and 2907. The majority of lectionaries, some Old Latin, the majority of the Syriac, the Sardic dialect of the Coptic, the Garima Gospels and other Ethiopic witnesses, the Gothic, some Armenian, Georgian MSS, of Adish, 9th century, Diatessaron, 2nd century, apparently Clement of Alexandria, died 215. Other church fathers, namely Tertullian, died 220. Origen, died 254. Cyprian, died 258. Non-News, died 431. Cyril of Alexandria, died 444. And Cosmas, died 550. Shorter pericope exclude. Minuscule 759 contains John chapter 7, 53-8, 2 but excludes 8, 3-11. Shorter pericope include 8, 3-11, 4, 67, 69, 70, 71, 75, 81, 89, 90, 98, 101, 107, 125, 126, 139, 146, 185, 211, 217, 229, 267, 280, 282, 287, 376, 381, 386, 390, 396, 398, 402, 405, 409, 417, 422, 430, 431, 435, 8, 2-11, 462, 464, 465, 520, 8, 2-11, include Pericope, Codex Bezer, 5th century, Codex Basilensis A, N. 3, 12, 8th century, 9th century Codices Borelianus, Sadelianus I, Sadelianus II, Cyprius, Campianus, Nannianus, also Tischendorfianus IV from the 10th. Codex Petropolitanus, minuscule 28, 318, 700, 892, 1009, 1010, 1071, 1079, 1195, 1216, 1344, 1365, 1546, 1646, 2148, 2174. The Byzantine Majority Text, 79, 100, John chapter 8, 1-11, 118, 130, 8, 1-11, 221, 274, 281, 411, 421, 429, 8, 1-11, 442, 8, 1-11, 445, 8, 1-11, 459. The majority of the Old Latin, the Vulgate, Codex Fuldensis, some Syriac, the Bohairic dialect of the Coptic, some Armenian, Didascalia, 3rd century, Didymus the Blind, 4th century, Ambrosiaster, 4th century, Ambrose, died 397, John Chrysostom, died 407, Jerome, died 420, Augustine, died 430. Question Pericope, marked with asterisk, or obeli, divided by, Codex Vaticanus III 554, s, and the minuscules 4, 8, 14, 18, 24, 35, 83, 95, questionable Scholian, 109, 125, 141, 148, 156, 161, 164, 165, 166, 167, 178, 179, 200, 202, 285, 338, 348, 363, 367, 376, 386, 407, 443, 478, 479, 510, 532, 547, 553, 645, 655, 656, 661, 662, 685, 757, 758, 763, 769, 781, 797, 801, 824, 825, 829, 844, 845, 867, 873, 897, 922, 1073, 1092, later hand, 1187, 1189, 1443 and 1445 include entire pericope from 753. The Menologian of Lectionary 185 includes 8. 1 ff. Codex Basilensis. E. includes 8. 2 ff. Codex Tischendorfianus 3. Lambda. And Petropolitanus. Also the Menologia of Lectionaries 86. 211, 1579 and 1761 include 8. 3 ff. Minuscule 807 is a manuscript with a catena, but only in John chapter 7. 53-8, 11 without catena. It is a characteristic of late Byzantine manuscripts conforming to the subtype family Kr. that this pericope is marked with obeli. Although Morris Robinson argues that these marks are intended to remind lectors that these verses are to be omitted from the Gospel lection for Pentecost, not to question the authenticity of the passage. Shorter pericope questioned. 8. 3-11, marked with asterisk, or obeli, divided by 707. Relocate pericope. Family 1. Minuscules 20, 37, 135, 207, 301, 347, and nearly all Armenian translations place the pericope after John chapter 21. 25. Family 13 place it after Luke chapter 24. 53. A corrector to minuscule 1333 added 8. 3-11 after Luke chapter 24. 53. And minuscule 225 includes the pericope after John chapter 7. 36. Minuscule 129. 135. 259. 470. 564. 831. 1076. 1078. And 1356 place John chapter 8. 3-11 after John chapter 21. 25. 788 and minuscule 826 placed pericope after Luke chapter 21. 38. Added by a later hand. Codex Egberti. 284. 431. 461. 470. 578. 2174. The pericope was never read as a part of the lesson for the Pentecost cycle. But John chapter 8, 3-8, 11 was reserved for the festivals of such saints as Theodora, September 18th, or Pelagia, October 8th. Some of the textual variants. See also, Parable of the Two Debtors. Other questioned passages, Johanneum, the longer ending of Mark. Matthew chapter 16, 2b-3, Christ's agony at Gethsemane. John chapter 5, 3b-4. Doxology to the Lord's Prayer. Luke chapter 22. 19b-20. Sortable articles. List of omitted Bible verses. John chapter 21. Textual criticism. John chapter 7. 53-8. 11. NIV. John chapter 7. 53-8. 11. KJV. Pericope Adulterae in manuscript comparator. Allows two or more New Testament manuscript editions readings of the passage to be compared in side-by-side and unified views. Similar to diff output. The Pericope de Adultera homepage site dedicated to proving that the passage is authentic, with links to a wide range of scholarly published material on both sides about all aspects of this text, and dozens of new articles. Jesus and the Adulteress. A detailed study by Wieland Wilke concerning the story of the adulteress in the 8th chapter of John. List marginal notes from several versions. Extended discussion taken from Samuel P. Tregethlas. Lists extended excerpts from an account of the printed text of the Greek New Testament. London, 1854. F. H. A. Scrivener. A Plain Introduction to the Criticism of the New Testament. 4th edition. London, 1894. Bruce Metzger. A Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament. Stuttgart, 1971. Raymond D. Brown. The Gospel According to John. IXII. In the Anchor Bible Series. Garden City, New York. Doubleday, 1966. The Woman Taken in Adultery. John chapter 7. 53-8. 11. In Defense of the Pericope de Adultera by Edward F. Hills. Taken from chapter 6 of his book. The King James Version Defended. 4th edition. Des Moines. Christian Research Press. 1984. David Robert Palmer. John chapter 5. 3b and the Pericope Adulterae.